The two things that my English background and youth had most featured, anxieties about class and the decline of empire, helped me to negotiate and explicate these subjects, both of which lay under a certain ban of denial or reticence to an American readership. It so happened that as I was finding my feet in New York, the public broadcasting system, sometimes known as Petroleum's British subsidiary, because of the salience of its mobile masterpiece theater, was screening Brideshead Revisited, with none other than William F. Buckley occupying Alastair Cook's customary leather armchair by the fireside. So though there were large events unfolding in the political world, from the application of the Reagan Doctrine in Central America to the drama in Poland and the clash over missile deployment, the first really long considerations that I wrote for The Nation and Mother Jones were about the intersections of class and empire. I drew on what I knew best, to stress that behind the manorial glamour of Brideshead Castle there lay the deep melancholy caused by the imperialist slaughter of 1914 through 1918. And that much of Tom Wolfe's celebrated style was part of a revival of a right-wing politics based on the defensive class consciousness of the well-off. Having sponged on my unimprovable friends Gully and Peter for long enough, I became the tenant of a walk-up on East 10th Street on the north side of Tompkins Square, found for me by the seemingly omni-connected Ian McEwan, and there I had a desk with a view across the town of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. My landlord had a good library in his small apartment, and the neighborhood, then very poor and grungy and old-style ethnic, with a traditional emphasis on Ukrainians, also featured several decent writerly cafes and restaurants. There was a coffee house called Di Roberti's, to which W. H. Auden had been known to shamble in his carpet slippers from St. Mark's Place. Auden, almost the only Englishman to have successfully mutated into an American, or at any rate certainly into a New Yorker. A previous occupant of his rather ramshackle old apartment building had been Leon Trotsky, who could have made a considerable American if things had been very, very different. One day, perhaps, we will uncover some of those old New York movies in which he was cast as an extra. I felt I had accomplished one rite of New York passage myself, by getting horribly mugged on my own front steps within a few months of moving in. I can still remember the burning shame of having not resisted, despite the assurances of the girl I was escorting that I had done the sensible thing. I shall never forget the choking horror of seeing the knife-wielding psycho turning back, having had second thoughts about not stabbing us after he realized that we had seen him too closely for too long, and the desperate haste with which we had slammed the street door behind us just in time, seeing him still menacing us and snarling through the glass. I coldly knew at that moment that if I had had a weapon on me, I would unhesitatingly have shot him dead. He was white, incidentally, though at the police precinct the surly cops laboriously showed me a whole album of deep black perps, before asking me if I was sure that the assailant hadn't been light Hispanic. By the time I'd said no to that, too, they obviously suspected me of being a bleeding heart liberal. The tempo of life in Manhattan seemed something like twice what it had been in London, and however late I went to bed, I invariably woke up early and couldn't get back to sleep. I was reading more and writing more, and furthermore writing for a new audience, of both editors and subscribers. After the overfamiliar clientele of the United Kingdom, yet I was also getting asked more by papers back home, as I swore to try not to think of it, to write about the United States. And what a subject America was, an inexhaustible one in fact, begun by written proclamations and assertions that were open to rewriting and revision and amendment, and thus constituting an enormous work in progress, in which one might hope to play a tiny part. It came to me that this was perhaps why I had felt such a strong push and pull of both emigration and immigration, that the need to write and the magnetic attraction of America had been two versions of the same impulse. One reason for my varied nightlife in New York was my friendship with Brian and Keith McNally, the two brothers who had opened the Odeon restaurant, now and always to be immortal in a certain zeitgeist, because it's the luminous illustration of the jacket of Bright Lights Big City. Just as you can't picture McInerney without that cover shot, so it suddenly seemed that you couldn't picture the background of it without McNally's. I felt awkwardly proud of having been friendly with them before they became so sought after. There had been a time when, of these two rather contrasting East Enders, Keith had been the suave maitre d', and Brian a bit more of the combo of barman and, if it absolutely came to it, bouncer. They were both accomplished autodidacts. Keith concentrated on the aesthetic and the theatrical. He was adored as a discovery by both Alan Bennett and Jonathan Miller, while Brian was more riveted by history and ideology. Without our ever making too much of actually saying so, we realized that in England we would probably never have met, or not on such socially easy terms. Brian it was who woke me very early one morning, sounding almost like a movie version of a Blitz-era Ealing Studios Cockney, and inveighing against a fucking diabolical liberty. This turned out to be, once my disordered senses had cleared, the Argentine invasion of the Falkland Islands. Far from home and fairly far from being Thatcherites, we were at one in the belief that under no circumstances could anybody put up with being pushed around by a crew of Buenos Aires brown shirts. The aggression for which my still vivid visit to Argentina had helped prepare me was the occasion for a fascinating division of forces and clash of opinions on both sides of the Atlantic. It seemed obvious to me that the military junta would never have dared attack a British territory unless it had been given some sort of green light from Washington. Indeed, it was at once reported that Jeane Kirkpatrick, Reagan's UN ambassador and leading apologist for the anti-communist dictatorships, had graced an Argentine diplomatic reception on the very night of the invasion. General Alexander Haig, Ronald Reagan's vain, preposterous Secretary of State, who also in his usual engorged condition of being crazy for anything that was militaristic, sadistic, and butch in a uniform. But the assurances given to Haig's equivalents in Buenos Aires had all been predicated on the assumption that the British would not fight for a stony archipelago at the wrong end of the world. I abruptly realized, for reasons that I believe had little, if anything, to do with my blood and heritage, and despite the impediment placed in the way of my becoming more American, that I would be unable to bear the shame if this assumption proved to be correct.